Hi, my name is Ruth Mostern. I'm a historian of China and a world historian. I work at the University of Pittsburgh, where I'm the director of the World History Center, and I've spent my career as a digital humanist focused on historical gazetteers. Now, historical gazetteers are basically a word for databases, spreadsheets, any kind of structured data that's organized around place names. When we think of spatial history, we often think about GIS, but for a lot of historians, where we have imperfect, inaccurate, conflicting information about the locations of things. We don't necessarily care that much about locations. We have unstructured text with a ton of place names. And gazetteers are the kind of methodology that you want to use if you're doing spatial history and you're starting with unstructured text or historical maps that are full of place names, and you're more interested in that than you are in absolute spatial accuracy for the kind of research and analysis you want to do. The slide you have up in front of you is the title of a book I co-edited about historical gazetteers, and you can see the table of contents on the other side of the screen. So I got started, the first major digital gazetteer project I did was for my first book. And my first book was about the what I call the spatial organization of state power in medieval China. So what I was interested in is how the Chinese imperial state in the 10th to the 13th century was managing the organization of its local and mid-sized government units. And I started with unstructured text like what you see there in Chinese, which has information about a location that was of interest to the state. It's a prefecture, and it explains how that changed over time. I used a text that modeled that information, like the one you see there with the arrow pointing to it, that sort of has in a more structured way in print what happened with that place. And I used that as the basis to build a gazetteer. That gazetteer is online, and you can see the URL at the bottom of the screen. One of the ways in which I'm a digital humanist is someone who is radically collaboratory. And that is partially because I think all of this work is done better when multiple people bring their skills and expertise to it, and also because I'm trained as a historian. I was never trained as a digital humanist. In fact, I was trained at a time before the term digital humanities even existed in the 90s. And so I've always worked with people who are database experts, GIS experts in different kinds of methodology. For this project, I worked with someone named Elijah Meeks, who's gone on to a very illustrious career in the field. And we developed a gazetteer that has the structure that you see here, where essentially what we're interested in is it's very simple. It's a big table of entities, and then for each entity, we have its location, we have some attributes about it. The really important thing here is the thing that's called the historical instance table, which is basically a table of change events. These are things that happen to places and at places, and that's what allows me to do the kind of reasoning that I want to do for my book about how things changed over time. And so I wrote this book that you see here in the middle of the screen, Dividing the Realm in Order to Govern, which explains how state power in China changed over time. I made a bunch of maps. I also made a bunch of timelines, and I think that timelines are a really, really underrated digital humanities visualization tool, especially for historians who want to show how things change over time. And for this short video, I'm not going to explain why it was such a revelation to learn that the ratio of counties to prefectures changed over time as much as it did, but that basically by using this visualization and this database, this gazetteer database, I was able to see things that had been entirely invisible in the field prior to that. So now I'm working on a new project. It's a long-term history of the Yellow River in China. It's an environmental history, and it's starting from the sort of the revelation of the last project, which is that was really interesting was this table of events. It's a much more, of course, don't take a look at the database structure. I'm showing this here just to show that there is a database, and that it's a much more complicated one than the one I showed you last, because it's a more complex structure with more heterogeneous kinds of data. What I'm interested in for this project, and all of my work as a digital humanist, all of it is question first, problem first, historian first, and then designing the simplest, most efficient tools I can and the most efficient methodologies I can to answer the questions that I want to answer as a historian. And in this case, it's about the relationship between how human activity in the upper courses of the Yellow River and human activity in the lower courses of the Yellow River mutually influenced one another. So I have places and I have events that happened at those places, and I got it from a bunch of structured text, which are what you see here. These are the titles in Chinese, or a bunch of paper books that I organized and modeled. Here I want to call out two collaborators. One is Ryan Horn, my database expert, my recent postdoc at the World History Center. The other is a phenomenal graduate student, former graduate student of mine at University of California, Merced, named Kai-Chi Hua, who did a monumental amount of historical reasoning and data entry for this project. The core of this project has a couple of cores. One of them is an event database. What you see here is a list of things that happened on the lower course, the floodplain of the Yellow River, primary sources about what happened, those structured secondary sources I got it from, the location, the date, and we also assigned, and here's me and my student Kai-Chi Hua, assigned every event one or more event types, and you'll see in a second that allows us to do a lot of really cool reasoning. This, by the way, does not yet exist online. This is still work in progress. I'll be posting it online around sometime probably during the calendar year 2020. So as I said, we assigned every event an event type. We have an event type vocabulary. I won't talk too much about this except to say if you do come up with your own structured vocabulary for any project you're doing, have some good data definitions, and that's what we have here. So in addition to the events, the event type vocabulary, I also have information about all of the locations where things happened. These are super local. These are like bridges, fords, confluences of rivers. It's pretty amazing that we were able to get that detailed. And as you can see in this case, we did assign precise latitudes and longitudes. And what this allows us to do, again, as I said, timelines I think are a really underrated tool of digital humanities visualization. And here, kind of inspired by what I showed you a few slides ago about the changing ratio of things over time, I'm zeroing in here on the changing ratio between disastrous events like floods and droughts and management events like building new levees or dredging out the river. And so not only can you see a clear break between a less disastrous and less managed period of river history and a more managed period of river history, you can also see that the ratio of disasters and management changed over time in ways that are really interesting and that are really forming the core of my new book. You can also do a lot of reasoning with the event types. I won't walk through these too much except to say that this is the timeline of management history, also shows a really interesting arc about the ways in which people were interacting with the floodplain over the very long time frame of almost 3,000 years that I'm looking at in this project. Of course, you can put things on maps. This is all of the events, the management events, the disaster events. You can see where it was on the floodplain that was most heavily scrutinized and managed in these sources. I have a lot to say about that in the project that I'm now completing. So then in addition, I have upstream data. This is just a straight up kind of very simple gazetteer. This started with born GIS data because it came from digitizing historical maps. And what I'm interested in here is charting out how human settlement in the upper course of the river changed over time, how it expanded over time, because that is what explains to me why the lower river became more unstable. So you can see some of that data here. So I want to now switch gears and talk for just a couple of minutes about a third project, and that is the World Historical Gazetteer. Now, each of the gazetteers that I've shown you is something that's really interesting to a tiny number of people only. It is super specialist data, but it's also the kind of data that could be integrated really meaningfully into a project at a global scale. So for instance, I'm interested in administrative change in medieval China. Someone else might be interested in a project like that in Europe or in China at a different time period. They would want to use my data even if they're not an expert on medieval China. So the idea of the World Historical Gazetteer is to build an infrastructure that allows people to use and share specialist gazetteers together. And here, the collaborator I want to call out most is Carl Grossner. He's the technical director of this project. He's done a huge amount of programming and standards development in order to develop this from scratch. So for this project, what you can see on this slide is that we started with a few sources that we thought would have a lot of frequently reused names, and we wanted to have place names, that is, since this is a gazetteer project. We have place names from ecology, we have place names from human politics. We've put them together. We have a core of about 20,000 place names, and we're integrating those, we're indexing those together with people's specialist data. You can see there in the middle of the screen in green is a collaborator project called the HGIS de las Indias. This is from a source about 16th century colonial Latin America. This is a perfect example of something that on its own is specialist data, but integrated at the global scale could be frequently reused by many different kinds of people. So we've built the standards, we've built the tools for indexing and visualizing this data. This should be going live in the summer of 2019. And in addition, and not to get too much into the weeds here, we've also built a series of ingest and reconciliation tools so that if you are the developer of a specialist gazetteer and you want to integrate it into this system, you can use semi-automated tools that we've set up essentially to ingest your gazetteer, see whether the place names that you've ingested are things that we already know about, and therefore create links that essentially hook your gazetteer. This is all based on linked open data methods, so the point is to link as many available URIs to one another and to create vast networks of information about different people's views of the same place, and also through something we're calling linked traces, in addition to linked places, also information about places. And this would be, for instance, the events that I was talking about in the previous two projects. So it's really a huge ever-growing place name encyclopedia that's based on linked open data methods and that's intended to be really usable for people who have simple specialist gazetteers that are structured enough to use in this format and that are web accessible, and also to allow users, including students and teachers, to be able to do gazetteer-based reasoning at the global scale. And so this is just a little bit more information about some of the tools we're developing: the linked places format, the linked traces format, a dashboard where you can manage the data that you've collected, the reconciliation tool, and the accessioning tool. So we're going to be rolling out this whole set of tools together. So in conclusion, once more, I want to say that this is radically collaborative work. I want to really pay homage to the scholars who I have been able to work with as students, as postdocs. One of the things I love most about doing this work is the chance for me as a historian to work with people who are so adept in a wide range of methodologies. And then finally, let me just conclude and say, I think gazetteers are really important. They're really underrated because when we think about spatial history, we so much want to go to maps. Everyone loves maps, but I hope I've introduced you to a range of kinds of reasoning that you can do if you start with names and textual information about names and information about things that happen at places, where for sure you can generate maps from that information, but where the map is really the things that's an ancillary visualization once you have structured place names. Thank you very much.